When we picture the Viking world, our minds often leap to roaring seas, dragon-headed ships, and fierce warriors sailing to distant shores. Yet before any voyage, before any raid or exploration, there was the homeland, a place shaped not by conquest, but by survival. Scandinavia, in the early medieval centuries, was not a land of abundance and ease. It was a land defined by extremes, long winters that seemed endless, landscapes both majestic and merciless, and a climate that forced every living creature to adapt or perish. To understand how the Vikings built warm homes in frozen lands, we must first pause and dwell in this environment, because it was the landscape itself that forged the architecture, the traditions, and the resilience of the people who called it home. Picture a Scandinavian winter. The sun, pale and distant, rises late and sets far too early, sometimes disappearing almost entirely during the long polar nights. The horizon glows faintly with bands of pink and orange, but this fleeting beauty gives little warmth. Snow carpets the ground for months on end, transforming fields into silent white deserts. The forests are heavy with frost, their branches bowing under the weight of ice. The winds howl across the fjords and mountains, carrying with them the sharp bite of cold that stings the skin and cuts through clothing like a blade. In these frozen landscapes, life slowed, and survival depended upon preparation. Food had to be stored, tools kept in working order, and most importantly, homes had to be strong enough to shield families from the relentless cold. Unlike the temperate climates of southern Europe or the fertile valleys of the Middle East, the Viking homelands offered little mercy. Growing seasons were short, crops uncertain, and animals had to be sheltered from the cold just as much as people. The land was both a provider and a punisher. Fjords and seas offered fish, but storms could claim lives in an instant. Forests supplied wood, yet they were dark and dangerous in winter. The soil gave grain only grudgingly, and what little was harvested had to be carefully guarded through the lean months. Every choice, from how a roof was laid to where a hearth was placed, was a choice against the threat of death by freezing. The home was not a luxury, it was the very line between life and loss. Yet within this unforgiving climate, there was also a stark beauty. Imagine the silence of a snowy night, when the only sound is the crunch of boots on frozen ground, or the distant crack of ice on a river. The stars blaze brightly, sharper than in warmer lands, and the northern lights sometimes dance across the sky in curtains of green and violet. For the Vikings, this was not just scenery, but the backdrop of existence. To live here was to accept both hardship and wonder. The home therefore became more than shelter. It was a sanctuary where cold and darkness could be kept at bay, and where the bonds of family and kinship grew stronger in the glow of firelight. It is easy for us today, surrounded by insulated walls and central heating, to forget the fragility of warmth. For the Vikings, warmth was never taken for granted. Every log burned was a resource carefully gathered. Every stone set into a wall, every turf block laid upon another, was an act of defiance against the cold. Their homes were designed not simply with comfort in mind, but with survival as the ultimate purpose. A poorly built house could mean frost creeping in through gaps, fire failing to spread its heat, or livestock freezing in their stalls. A well-built home, on the other hand, could cradle life through the darkest season and give hope of spring. The Vikings did not live as isolated individuals. They lived as families, clans, and communities. The environment demanded cooperation. While a warrior might leave to raid or trade, the true strength of Viking society lay in the collective efforts of those who stayed behind to tend fields, care for animals, and above all maintain the household. During winter, when the world outside was dangerous and unyielding, the home became the center of existence. Here firelight illuminated carved wooden beams. Here the scent of smoke mingled with the smell of stored grain, salted fish, and woolen clothing drying by the flames. Here stories of gods and ancestors were told, weaving warmth of a different kind, warmth of memory, imagination, and belonging. It is no coincidence that in Old Norse mythology, halls feature prominently. The Great Hall of Odin, Valhalla, was imagined as a place where warriors gathered by the fire, feasting endlessly. This vision of warmth, fellowship, and light was not abstract. It reflected the real importance of the hall in daily Viking life. The idea of the home as a hall of safety, a fortress of fire against frost, shaped both their spiritual and practical worlds. In this way, the harsh northern climate did not merely influence the design of Viking homes. It embedded the very concept of the home into their culture as a symbol of survival, strength, and kinship. Yet before we dive into the architecture itself, before we speak of timber frames, turf roofs, and hearth fires, it is important to feel the weight of the challenge the Vikings faced. Imagine standing at the edge of a windswept ford in midwinter. Your breath clouds in the air, and the cold is so sharp it seems to seize your lungs. The nearest village lies in the distance, a cluster of low-roofed buildings half buried under snow. Smoke curls from small vents, rising into the pale sky. Inside those buildings, families huddle close, the fire at the center casting flickering shadows on walls of earth and wood. Outside, death waits patiently in the form of frost. Inside, life clings to warmth. This was the balance the Vikings mastered, to build homes that could transform nature's hostility into a space of safety. The architecture of their houses was not grand in the sense of stone castles or marble temples. It was grand in its purpose. Every design choice, long and narrow layouts, thick walls, sod insulation, shared spaces, was honed through generations of experience, and it worked. Despite the severity of their environment, the Vikings not only survived but thrived, sailing outward to explore and conquer, returning always to these homes that held the secret of endurance. The frozen horizons of the north may have seemed unyielding, but within them grew a culture of resilience, innovation, and communal strength. The Viking home was the beating heart of this world, proof that humanity can carve out warmth even in the coldest of lands. To understand the brilliance of how Vikings built warm homes in frozen places, we must begin here, with the land itself, vast, unforgiving, and yet alive with the spark of survival.
If the landscape was the frame of Viking life, then fire was its very heartbeat. In the frozen north, where winters dragged on and ice locked the land in silence, fire was more than just a tool, it was survival itself. For the Vikings, the hearth stood at the center of the home, a glowing core of light and warmth. Around it unfolded the rhythms of daily life, meals prepared, stories told, children comforted, and elders remembered. To step into a Viking house was to step into a world where fire was the quiet ruler, commanding respect and shaping existence. Imagine entering a longhouse on a bitter night. The outside world is frozen, the ground hard beneath drifting snow, the winds sharp and merciless. Yet inside the scene changes. Shadows ripple across timber beams as firelight flickers, casting warm hues of orange and gold. The air is thick with smoke, carrying the mingled scents of burning wood, roasting meat and wool. People cluster around the flames, their cloaks steaming from melted frost, their faces softened by the glow. In this moment, one understands why the hearth was never taken for granted. It was not simply a convenience, it was life preserved against the reach of death. The hearth, typically an open fire pit placed in the center of the hall, was carefully designed for balance. It needed to radiate heat, yet it also had to release smoke. Too much smoke, and the air would become choking and unbearable. Too little, and the heat would be lost too quickly. The Vikings solved this problem with a blend of practicality and endurance. A small opening in the roof, sometimes nothing more than a vent cut into turf or wood, allowed smoke to escape, but it was never perfect. The interior of a Viking home was often hazy, eyes stinging from the smoke, clothing infused with the sharp tang of fire. And yet this was considered the price of survival. A smoky house was a warm house, a clean, cold house was far worse. The hearth was also the kitchen. Over its flames, meals were cooked in iron cauldrons or clay pots, meat sizzled on skewers, porridge bubbled slowly, and fish smoked gently above embers. Cooking in Viking times was no small task. It was constant labor. The fire had to be tended at all hours, and the distribution of fuel was carefully managed. Wood was precious, especially in lands where forests were sparse. Turf and peat were often burned as well, filling the air with their earthy aroma. Children grew up with the constant presence of smoke and flame, learning from an early age how to respect and tend the fire, for without it there would be no warmth, no food and no comfort. Beyond its practical use, the hearth carried deep symbolic meaning. In many Indo-European traditions, fire was sacred, and the Vikings were no different. The hearth was seen as a bridge between the mortal world and the divine, a place where offerings could be made to gods and spirits. Ashes and embers held a certain magic, the remains of something consumed but not destroyed. The flickering flames were often thought of as living, dancing entities, almost like companions within the hall. At night, when the wind howled outside, the glow of the hearth felt like the very spirit of protection. The hearth was also a social anchor. In the long winters when outdoor work was limited and the cold made travel dangerous, families gathered in close quarters. By firelight they mended clothing, crafted tools, wove textiles and shared food. But perhaps most importantly, they shared stories, the sagas that would later be written down. Tales of gods, heroes and legendary voyages were first spoken here beside the flames. The rhythm of a storyteller's voice mingled with the crackle of burning wood. Children listened wide-eyed, elders nodded with remembrance, and in this exchange culture was passed from one generation to the next. Fire was not just warmth, it was memory preserved, identity shared. We can imagine how the hearth shaped the very architecture of Viking homes. The longhouse was built around it, with benches lining the walls and sleeping areas arranged nearby. Animals often shared the same building, their body heat contributing to the overall warmth. The fire was positioned so that its warmth could spread evenly, while the smoke vent allowed just enough air to circulate. This central placement reinforced its symbolic role as well. The hearth was literally and figuratively the core of life. Without it, the hall would be a shell, empty and cold. With it, the hall was alive, pulsing with warmth and light. Archaeological remains of Viking hearths tell us much about their construction. Many were built as rectangular pits lined with stones to contain the fire. Some show evidence of clay or sand being used to insulate and protect the floor. Around these hearths, layers of ash have been discovered, testimony to years of continuous use. Ash was not always cleared away, sometimes it was left to insulate embers, making it easier to rekindle flames the next morning. In this way the fire was never truly extinguished. It was carried forward day by day, a continuous thread linking each night to the next. This continuity gave fire an almost eternal quality, something that tied the household to the cycles of time and the enduring struggle against winter. Fuel management was another critical aspect of hearth life. In regions with abundant forests, wood was plentiful, though it still required labor to cut and carry. In Iceland or Greenland, however, wood was scarce, and alternatives like peat, driftwood, or even dried animal dung were used. Each fuel had its own qualities. Wood burned hot and bright, peat smoldered with long-lasting heat, but more smoke, while driftwood carried the salty tang of the sea. Families learned to adapt, blending resources depending on what was available. The mastery of fire was in truth the mastery of survival strategies in environments where nothing could be wasted. The hearth also carried social meaning beyond the family. In great halls where chieftains gathered warriors and guests, the fire became a symbol of hospitality. To sit by the fire was to be included, to be offered warmth and food. Refusing someone this space was a grave insult, while granting it was a gesture of friendship or alliance. Feasts were structured around the hearth, with seats arranged according to status, and the glow of fire uniting all in shared light. Thus the hearth was both intimate and political, a site of family closeness and a stage for social order. Finally, we must consider the emotional impact of fire on Viking life. In a world of dark winters, fire was the only light after sunset. Candles and oil lamps existed, but they were small secondary sources. The hearth dominated the senses. Its glow was the visual center, its heat, the physical comfort, its sound, the constant crackle in the background. The Vikings lived in a relationship with fire that is hard for us to fully grasp today. It was not taken for granted, not hidden behind technology, but immediate, alive, and demanding attention. To wake in the night and see the faint glow of embers was to know safety. To hear the fire sputter and fade was to feel unease. Fire was both companion and necessity, trusted and revered. Thus the hearth was not merely an element of Viking homes. It was the essence of them, practical, symbolic, and social. It defined the way people lived, ate, worked, and dreamed. In the frozen north, where ice ruled the land, fire ruled the home, and at the center of every longhouse, from the humblest turf dwelling to the grandest chieftain's hall, burned the same flame, a fragile, flickering miracle that held life together in the cold. Before the longhouse rose as the defining structure of Viking society, there were humbler beginnings, simple shelters built to resist the same biting winds and endless winters. These earlier homes, less celebrated than the iconic halls of saga and legend, tell us a quieter story, a story of trial, error, adaptation, and the long path toward architectural mastery. To understand the brilliance of Viking homes, we must look first at the foundations, not just physical but cultural, laid by their ancestors. Centuries before the Viking Age, people across Scandinavia already faced the same relentless challenges of climate. The winters were no less cold, the growing seasons no less short. Communities needed homes that could be built quickly, repaired easily, and above all insulated against the harshness of the north. The earliest structures archaeologists suggest were little more than huts, modest, functional shelters of wood, brush, and sod. They were not meant to impress nor to last for centuries. They were meant to keep people alive through one season at a time. One of the oldest known forms was the pit house or sunken hut, which left traces across northern Europe. Imagine a shallow rectangular or oval pit dug into the ground, its floor set below the surrounding surface. Over this depression, walls of wattle and daub or turf were built, and a roof of thatch or wood laid across. The pit house was small, often no larger than a modern bedroom. Its advantage lay in its design. By setting the floor below ground level, the cold winds were blocked, and the earth itself provided insulation. Heat from a small hearth inside could linger, trapped within the low, thick walls, cramped and smoky though they were. Pit houses represented a practical solution for early farmers and herders facing brutal winters. Over time, these pit houses evolved. Some were expanded into larger semi-subterranean structures, while others were supplemented by above-ground sheds and animal shelters. Communities experimented with materials. In forested regions, timber beams were used. In rocky areas, stone foundations were added. In grasslands, thick turf became the walls. Necessity bred variety. Each landscape dictated its own version of the same core idea: dig down, cover up, and trap heat where it was needed most. Yet such shelters, while useful, had their limits. They could house only small families. They offered little space for communal gatherings, and their low ceilings and smoky interiors were uncomfortable for long stays. As populations grew and social structures became more complex, these modest huts no longer sufficed. People needed buildings that could host extended families, protect valuable livestock, and serve as centers of social life. The transformation from pit hut to longhouse did not happen overnight, but slowly over generations, as needs expanded and knowledge accumulated. Archaeological evidence from the Nordic Bronze Age and early Iron Age shows the gradual rise of long rectangular houses that foreshadowed the Viking longhouse. These structures, often over 10 meters in length, combined living quarters for humans with stalls for animals. The idea was simple but ingenious. By sheltering cattle, sheep, or goats under the same roof as people, heat from the animals' bodies contributed to the overall warmth. This blending of functions marked a critical step forward. Homes were no longer just shelters. They became integrated survival systems where people and animals shared resources, warmth, and protection. These proto-longhouses were still rough compared to later Viking examples. Their walls might be woven from branches and daubed with clay, their roofs steep thatched structures prone to leaks, but they represented a leap in vision. Instead of small, scattered huts, families began building elongated halls where many could dwell together. Inside, space was divided into sections, one for people, one for animals, one for storage. The hearth, now placed more centrally, served everyone. Smoke curled into rafters, blackened over years, slowly transforming wood beams into charcoal-hued monuments of survival. Consider the contrast between the pit hut and the early longhouse. In the hut, survival was solitary, cramped and temporary. In the hall, survival became communal, enduring and structured. This shift reflected broader changes in society itself. Kinship groups became stronger, hierarchies clearer, and cooperation more essential. A longhouse required more labor to build, but it also symbolized greater permanence. It was not just a shelter for a season, it was a home meant to stand for generations. The transition also reveals how early Scandinavians thought about warmth. In a pit hut, heat was something hoarded, kept close and low to the ground. In a hall, heat was something shared, spread across a larger group. The physical expansion of the building mirrored the expansion of the community. Fire, once flickering in a cramped corner, now glowed at the center of a gathering space. The architecture itself reinforced the bonds between people. To sit together around the same hearth was to live as kin, to acknowledge shared survival in a hostile world. Still, these early halls were not without flaws. Ventilation remained a constant problem. Smoke often gathered under the roof, stinging eyes and lungs. Roofs sagged under the weight of snow, if not carefully constructed. Walls of wattle and daub cracked in the cold and required frequent repair. And yet people endured, improving techniques with each generation. Slowly lessons were learned. Thicker turf held heat longer, angled roofs shed snow better, timber frames could last decades if properly set in the ground. Each improvement paved the way toward the fully realized Viking longhouse that would dominate later centuries. It is easy when studying history to jump directly to the iconic, to skip from humble beginnings to celebrated achievements. But in truth, the glory of the Viking longhouse cannot be understood without the memory of these earlier shelters. They remind us of a simple truth: innovation is not born fully formed. It is shaped by hardship, refined by necessity, and carried forward by countless hands. The pit hut, the semi-subterranean dwelling, the rough timber hall, all were stepping stones across the long path of adaptation. For the families who lived in them, these early shelters were not inadequate, they were lifelines. To step inside one after hours of labor in the snow, to feel even a faint warmth on the skin, was to feel hope. To huddle together under a roof of thatch while storms raged outside was to remember that human beings, fragile though they were, had the power to bend nature to their needs. These dwellings were small victories carved out of the cold. Thus, before the Viking longhouse came into being, there was already a tradition of resilience in architecture, a tradition that understood the value of earth as insulation, animals as sources of warmth, and communal living as a strategy for survival. The pit huts and early halls may seem crude to us now, but they carried within them the seeds of something far greater. Out of their smoke-filled rooms and frozen beams, the idea of the longhouse was born, a structure that would not only house generations but would come to symbolize an entire way of life. When people speak of Viking homes, the image that most often rises is the longhouse. It was more than a building, it was an idea, a symbol, a revolution in how communities sheltered themselves against the cold and against time. The longhouse did not appear suddenly, but when it emerged, it transformed life in the north, where earlier huts and pit dwellings had provided only the barest survival. The longhouse gave permanence, scale, and a sense of shared belonging. It was a structure that embodied the Viking way, communal, practical, and enduring. To step into a Viking longhouse was to step into the very heart of their world. Picture a longhouse from the outside. It stands low and wide against the horizon, its sloping roof heavy with turf or thatch, blending into the landscape almost as if it had grown there. Smoke drifts lazily from small vents, disappearing into the cold air. The walls are thick, built from timber planks, wattle and daub, or blocks of turf depending on the region. The ground around it is packed by countless footsteps, children running, livestock moving in and out, men and women hauling water, firewood and tools. The longhouse does not look like a castle, nor like a palace. Its strength lies not in grandeur, but in its ability to endure. It is built low against the wind, strong against the snow, and large enough to gather an entire extended family under one roof. Step inside, and the first thing that greets you is warmth, not the delicate heat of a small hearth, but the deeper, fuller warmth of fire spreading through a great hall. Shadows flicker on walls, darkened with years of smoke. The interior stretches long and narrow, with a central aisle leading from one end to the other. Benches and platforms line the sides, serving as both seating and sleeping areas. Furs and blankets are laid out for rest, while storage chests line the walls. At the center, the hearth burns steadily, its flames glowing against stone or clay boundaries. Above, smoke drifts into the rafters, escaping slowly through vents cut into the roof. The air is hazy, rich with the mingled scents of wood, food, and people. This is the world of the Viking longhouse, alive, crowded, and vital. The dimensions of longhouses varied, but many reached impressive sizes. Some stretched 20, 30, even 50 meters in length, great halls that could hold dozens of people along with their animals. The width was usually around 5 to 7 meters, giving space for both the central aisle and the raised side platforms. Roofs were steeply pitched to shed snow and rain, supported by heavy timber beams set into the ground. These beams, known as posts, were the skeleton of the house, their weight carrying the burden of the roof. The posts created a rhythm within the hall, dividing the space into bays, each with its own function. In one bay, animals might be tethered, in another grain stored, in yet another family members gathered to sleep or work. The longhouse was not a single-purpose structure, it was a living ecosystem, a place where humans, animals, tools, and food all coexisted under one shelter. The communal nature of the longhouse cannot be overstated. Privacy, as we think of it today, barely existed. Families slept side by side, children near parents, servants near masters, everyone within earshot of one another. At first glance this might seem uncomfortable, yet in the Viking world it was a strength. Togetherness was security, warmth was shared, tasks were shared, stories were shared. In the dark of winter, when outside travel was dangerous, the longhouse became a cocoon of community, a place where bonds were forged and reinforced daily. To live in a longhouse was to live not as an isolated individual but as part of a whole. Animals were a vital part of this whole. Cows, goats, and sheep often lived in stalls at one end of the hall. Their presence was not merely for convenience, it was part of the survival strategy. The heat of their bodies added to the overall warmth of the house, and their proximity ensured they were safe from predators and theft. In return, people endured the smells, the sounds, and the constant need for cleaning. The Viking longhouse was not pristine or silent. It was filled with the hum of daily life, the lowing of cattle, the bleating of sheep, the crackle of fire, the murmur of conversation. It was noisy, smoky, and sometimes foul, but it was alive, and in that life lay strength. The longhouse was also a place of hierarchy. Not all spaces within it were equal. The central hearth belonged to the family, but seating positions around it reflected status. The head of the household or chieftain claimed the most honored spot, often near the central fire or at the high seat against the wall. Guests of importance were seated accordingly, their placement reflecting their worth. Even within the intimacy of shared space, order was maintained. A visitor could tell much about a household simply by where they were asked to sit. The construction of a longhouse was a communal task. Raising the heavy beams required many hands, and the gathering of turf, thatch, and timber was labor-intensive. Families worked together, and neighbors often assisted, reinforcing ties of kinship and obligation. Building a longhouse was not just about creating a dwelling, it was about establishing roots, declaring permanence in a landscape that demanded constant resilience. Each beam, each sod, was a statement: here we will stay, here we will endure. The symbolism of the longhouse reached deep into Viking identity. Just as Odin's hall Valhalla was imagined as a grand gathering place of heroes, so too was the earthly hall the center of human life. Feasts, councils, and rituals all took place within these walls. The longhouse was not merely a home but a stage where the dramas of life unfolded, births celebrated, marriages witnessed, disputes resolved, deaths mourned. It was both shelter and sacred space, ordinary and extraordinary at once. We can imagine a winter evening within such a hall. The wind howls outside, battering the roof with snow and sleet. Inside, the fire glows surrounded by family and kin. Children play with carved wooden toys on the benches. Women weave or mend clothing, their hands moving steadily in the flickering light. Men repair tools, sharpen blades, or carve wood. Elders tell stories, their voices carrying the weight of memory. The air is smoky but warm, the atmosphere close but comforting. Beyond the walls, the world is hostile and frozen within. It is alive with warmth and community. This contrast is what made the Longhouse such a triumph. It transformed an unforgiving landscape into a place where life could not only continue but thrive. Archaeological discoveries confirm the scale and sophistication of these structures. In places like Borg and Lofoten, Norway, reconstructed longhouses stretch nearly 80 meters, testifying to the ambition and skill of their builders. Post holes in the ground mark the rhythm of ancient beams, while remnants of hearths reveal where fires once burned for generations. These ruins remind us that the longhouse was not a fleeting invention but a cornerstone of Viking life, enduring across centuries and landscapes. The revolution of the longhouse lay not only in its physical form but in its philosophy. It declared that survival was collective. It embodied the idea that warmth, food, and labor must be shared. It showed that people and animals, though different, belonged to the same fragile system of life. It was an architecture of necessity elevated into a way of being, and for centuries it worked. The longhouse sheltered countless generations through winters that would have otherwise been unbearable, serving as the cradle of Viking society. Thus, when we speak of the longhouse, we are not merely describing wood, turf, and fire. We are speaking of the very heart of a culture, a building that reflected the values of kinship, endurance, and adaptability. It was a home, a hall, a fortress, and a symbol all at once. It was the revolution that allowed the Vikings not just to survive in frozen lands but to flourish, to dream, and eventually to venture far beyond their icy horizons. Every Viking home began not with drawings on parchment or grand visions of architecture, but with the land itself, the forests, the rocky hillsides, the open fields, and the windswept coasts provided the raw materials. In the frozen north there were no vast quarries of marble, no endless plains of brick-making clay. There was instead what nature offered: wood, stone, turf, and earth. From these elements, Vikings created homes that were not only functional, but also beautifully adapted to their surroundings. To understand their houses is to understand how deeply the Vikings read the language of the land. Wood was the backbone of most Viking structures. Scandinavia, particularly Norway and Sweden, was rich in forests. Pine, oak, birch, and spruce grew in abundance, and each type of wood offered its own qualities. Oak was strong and durable, ideal for beams and posts. Pine and spruce, lighter and more flexible, made good planks and roofing supports. Birch, though less robust, was plentiful and useful for smaller fixtures. To a Viking, trees were not only sources of fuel but also the skeleton of shelter. A carefully chosen tree, cut at the right season and cured properly, could stand for decades as part of a longhouse frame. The straight trunks became roof supports. The branches and bark were stripped for kindling and roofing, and nothing was wasted. Felling and shaping timber was no easy task. Without modern saws or power tools, Vikings relied on iron axes, adzes, and chisels. These tools, though simple by today's standards, were marvels of craftsmanship. The iron was forged by skilled smiths, the handles carved to fit comfortably in the hand. Cutting a single beam required hours of labor, and raising it into place took many more. Building a longhouse from timber was therefore not a casual undertaking. It demanded planning, effort, and the coordinated work of many hands. Yet once completed, these timber skeletons gave Viking houses their strength and longevity. But not all Viking lands were rich in forests. In Iceland, for example, settlers found themselves in a treeless landscape where wood was scarce, and driftwood carried by the sea was often the only supply. Here innovation flourished. Instead of relying on timber, Icelandic builders turned to the earth itself. They cut blocks of turf, thick slabs of grass and soil bound tightly by roots, and stacked them like bricks to form walls. These turf walls were remarkably effective, providing insulation that timber alone could not match. In winter the walls held heat, in summer they kept the interior cool. A turf house seemed almost to grow out of the ground, blending seamlessly with the surrounding hills. To step inside was to enter a home literally carved from the earth, warm and muffled against the outside world. Greenland posed different challenges. Its terrain was rocky, its climate harsher still. Here stone became the primary building material. Vikings constructed walls from stacked rocks, filling gaps with turf and earth. Roofs were laid with timber when available, but often driftwood or even whalebone was used to create a frame strong enough to support heavy turf coverings. These homes were rugged, built to withstand the brutal winds that swept in from the icy seas. Though darker and colder inside than their timber or turf counterparts, they offered durability in a place where few other options existed. To build with stone was to concede to the land's stubbornness, yet even here the Vikings found ways to make homes warm enough to survive. The adaptability of Viking builders was their true genius. They did not force the same design on every landscape. Instead they listened to the land. In forested Norway, homes were tall timber-rich structures. In treeless Iceland, they became low, turf-insulated shelters. In Greenland they became stone fortresses, and when the Vikings voyaged to distant shores, to the British Isles, to Ireland, even to Vinland across the Atlantic, they once again adapted. Sometimes they borrowed local methods, blending them with their own traditions. Sometimes they imposed their style, leaving behind traces of Nordic design in foreign soil. In every case, the home became a conversation between human need and natural possibility. Stone, wood, and earth were not only practical choices but symbolic ones. Each material carried meanings. Wood was alive, cut from the forest, imbued with strength. Stone was eternal, unyielding, a reminder of the mountains and fjords that shaped the northern horizon. Earth, soft yet enduring, represented fertility, the soil from which life sprang. To live in a house of wood, stone, and earth was to live in harmony with the very elements that sustained existence. Vikings saw their homes not as intrusions upon the land but as extensions of it, rooted in the same cycles of growth, decay, and renewal. Roofing materials reflected this same ingenuity. Where reeds and grasses grew, thatch was used, woven tightly to shed water and snow. Where turf was abundant, roofs were covered in thick layers of soil and grass which grew lush and green in summer, blending the home into the hillside. A turf roof was heavy, but it was also remarkably effective at keeping out the cold. Rain seeped into the soil, but the tightly bound roots held it firm, creating a living shield above the hall. Standing at a distance, a Viking house with a turf roof could be mistaken for part of the landscape itself, as if nature had chosen to shelter its people. Inside, the choice of materials shaped the atmosphere. Timber walls creaked softly in the wind. Stone walls held the chill of the earth. Turf walls gave off a faint earthy smell, a constant reminder of the land's closeness. Each home had its own character, drawn directly from its materials. The Vikings lived not in identical dwellings, but in homes as varied as the terrains they occupied. Yet all shared a common purpose: to transform the rawness of nature into a sanctuary of warmth. The process of building was itself a ritual of survival. Men cut timber and shaped beams, women and children gathered turf, stones, or reeds, and entire communities came together to raise walls and roofs. The act of construction was as important as the finished home. It bound people together, reinforced their relationship with the land, and reminded them that survival was never an individual effort. Each beam raised, each turf laid, was a collective defiance against the cold. Each completed house stood as proof of resilience, ingenuity, and trust in one another. Thus the Viking home was not only crafted from nature, but with nature. Its materials were chosen not out of luxury, but out of necessity, and yet the results were elegant in their simplicity. These homes stood low and strong, shaped by forests, fields, and stone-strewn coasts. They were not separate from the land, but deeply connected to it, each one an answer to the eternal question posed by the North: how shall we endure the cold? The Vikings answered with wood, with stone, with earth, and with the courage to transform hardship into shelter. When you think of the Viking world, the first images that arise are often of longships slicing across icy seas, warriors with shields glinting in the frost, and winds howling over rugged fjords. Yet behind these grand visions lies a quieter, less celebrated ingenuity, the art of keeping warm. Survival in the North was not only about swords or sails, but about finding ways to hold on to heat when the world outside was frozen solid. The Vikings became masters of insulation, creating homes that could trap warmth and soften the bite of the endless cold. Their methods may appear simple at first glance: turf walls, sod roofs, thick layers of earth, yet in truth they reveal a deep understanding of how to bend nature itself into a shield. Turf, that humble mixture of grass, soil, and root, was among their most important discoveries. Cut from the ground in heavy slabs, turf was laid one upon another like bricks. But unlike stone, turf was alive, its roots bound it together, and its compact earth trapped air pockets within. These air pockets were the secret. They held heat inside and prevented the cold from seeping through. In winter, turf walls functioned like natural insulation, absorbing warmth from the fire at night and releasing it slowly back into the room. In summer, the same walls kept the house cool, shielding it from the glare of the sun. Without turf, the longhouses of Iceland or Greenland would have been little more than wind-blown huts. With it, they became havens of endurance. Cutting turf required skill. Too thin, and the slabs would crumble. Too thick, and they would not stack properly. The Vikings chose strips about as wide as a man's arm, cut with long knives or spades. Each block was heavy but portable, and once cut, the roots began to dry, holding the slab in shape. Builders staggered the slabs like masonry, overlapping them so no seam lined up with another. Over time, the turf settled into place, binding together into a dense, cohesive wall. In some houses, these walls were more than a meter thick, so wide that a person could sit comfortably upon them. Looking at such walls, you see not just earth but the stored energy of life itself, pressed into service. Above these turf walls rose the sod roofs. A Viking roof was more than a simple covering against rain. It was a living system. The builders began with a frame of timber, sometimes driftwood, sometimes whalebone in Greenland. Upon this they laid birch bark or other waterproof layers. Then came the sod, thick, heavy rolls of grass and soil stacked in overlapping rows. Over time the grass continued to grow, binding the roof together. Seen from a distance in summer, a turf-roofed house looked like a mound of earth, green and lush, as though a meadow had simply risen from the ground to arch overhead. In winter, snow gathered upon it, blending the house into the white hills. Function met beauty, and insulation became part of the landscape itself. The sod roof was more than camouflage. Its thickness prevented rain from leaking in, and snow from penetrating down. More importantly, like turf walls, it trapped heat. In combination, walls and roof formed an insulating shell. Fires built inside could now sustain warmth for hours, even days. Families gathered around the hearth, not in freezing discomfort, but in relative coziness, listening to the storm howl outside, while the thick sod walls muffled the sound. The Viking home was not silent. The wind always found cracks, the timbers creaked, the fire hissed, but it was a sanctuary. The warmth held within those walls was a quiet triumph, a daily victory over the cold. The idea of living inside walls of soil may seem primitive to modern eyes, yet to the Vikings it was elegance in simplicity. Nature offered them insulation, and they took it without excess or waste. In Iceland, where volcanic soil held heat well, turf walls performed superbly. In Greenland, where wood was scarce, stone walls combined with turf layers to create equally effective barriers. Each region adapted the principle to its own environment. The key was always the same: trap the warmth, conserve it, and let no breath of winter steal it away. Inside, these turf walls also shaped the atmosphere. They softened sound, making interiors quieter. They gave off a faint, earthy smell, a reminder of the land's closeness. Light from the central fire glowed against their dark surface, and shadows played upon the uneven textures. To sleep against a turf wall was to feel the earth itself at your back, solid and sheltering. Children nestled in alcoves carved into these walls, and families pressed their bedding against them, knowing the warmth would linger longer there. The house was not only a structure but an organism of soil, wood and heat, breathing in rhythm with its inhabitants. Insulation extended beyond walls and roofs. Vikings often sunk their houses partially into the ground, creating what we might call semi-dugouts. By lowering the floor level, they reduced exposure to wind and gained the natural insulation of the earth itself. Cold air settled lower, while warmer air from the fire rose and spread. In Greenland, such designs were common. Stone walls, turf linings, and sunken floors combined into homes capable of resisting temperatures that would otherwise have been unbearable. Once inside, a person felt as though they had descended into a cave, secure from the outer world. The contrast between the bitter cold outside and the muffled warmth within was profound, almost spiritual. Another subtle form of insulation came through animal hides and textiles. Skins hung across doorways, reduced drafts. Woolen tapestries covered walls, adding another layer of warmth. These textiles, dyed with rich colors, were both decorative and practical. Imagine entering a hall, the turf walls hidden behind woven hangings, the firelight flickering upon embroidered patterns, the warmth pressing softly against your skin. This was not a bleak hut, but a living, breathing home, alive with color, texture and warmth, all made possible because insulation kept the cold at bay. The genius of turf and sod lay in their renewability. Unlike cut stone or timber, they could be replaced easily. A roof that wore thin could be patched with fresh sod. A wall that crumbled could be rebuilt from the same field it once stood upon. This cyclical relationship with the land mirrored the cycles of Viking life itself, sowing and reaping, voyaging and returning, enduring winter and rejoicing in summer. Their homes were not monuments but companions, born of the earth and returned to it. There is something profoundly symbolic in this approach. Viking houses covered in grass and soil were inseparable from the land. They were not alien impositions upon nature but collaborations with it. The people lived inside the very earth they farmed and trod upon, warmed by its embrace. Their fires burned within walls that had once been fields. In this way, survival and belonging intertwined. Each home became a small universe of warmth carved from a cold world, a testament to humanity's ability to thrive in harmony with its environment. For the Vikings, insulation was not an afterthought. It was survival itself. Without turf and sod, their longhouses would have been drafty shells, unable to protect them from nights that plunged below freezing. With them they became strongholds of life, places where children could grow, elders could endure, and stories could be told around the fire. In their quiet, earthy strength, turf walls and sod roofs made possible not only daily comfort, but the expansion of Viking society across some of the harshest climates in the known world. Thus, when we picture the Viking home, we must look beyond the wooden beams and smoke-filled halls. We must imagine the living earth pressed into service, shaped into walls and roofs rising above and around those who dwelt within. We must see homes that blended into hillsides, roofs blooming green in summer and white with snow in winter. We must feel the warmth held tight inside, the silence that wrapped around families as they slept. This was the true heart of insulation, not mere technique, but a deep, practical poetry. In turf and sod, the Vikings discovered a way to turn the earth itself into a blanket against the cold. And under that blanket, life in the frozen lands could not only endure but flourish. Step now across the threshold of a Viking home. The cold outside is sharp, biting, a reminder of the endless struggle against the northern wind. Yet once the heavy wooden door is pulled open and you step within, the world changes. The air is thick with warmth, and the faint tang of smoke. Shadows dance against the turf walls, and the first thing that captures your gaze is the hearth, the very heart of the house. the glowing center around which all life revolves. The Viking hearth was not simply a place for cooking, it was the soul of the dwelling. Set along the center of the hall, a long, shallow fire pit stretched across the room. Its flames reached upward, licking the beams above, filling the air with warmth and the faint haze of smoke. There was no chimney as we know today. Instead, a hole in the roof allowed smoke to escape, though much of it lingered inside, curling along the rafters. At times the air grew thick, eyes watered, and lungs burned. Yet to the Vikings this smoke was not just a nuisance. It cured the wooden beams, hardened them, and preserved the turf roof from decay. The very discomfort became protection, a trade the people gladly made. Around this fire, life unfolded. Children played near the glowing embers, carefully watched by their mothers. Warriors sharpened their blades by the flickering light. Women wove cloth, spun wool, and prepared meals. Elders leaned close to the fire, soaking in its warmth, telling stories of the old gods and the ancestors who had braved seas and snow before them. The hearth was the center of all: warmth, food, light, and memory, all bound together by fire. The layout of the longhouse was designed to serve this central flame. Along either side of the hall were raised wooden benches or platforms. By day, these benches were places to sit, to work, to talk. By night, they transformed into sleeping spaces, covered in furs and blankets. The family, and sometimes even their livestock in colder months, shared this same hall. At first, this closeness may sound crowded, even uncomfortable, but in the deep winter, when the wind howled and snow buried the fields outside, such closeness meant survival. Warmth was not just kept by fire, but by bodies gathered side by side, sharing heat beneath layers of wool and fur. At the far ends of the hall stood storage areas where tools, weapons, and food were kept. Baskets of dried fish, cured meats, and grains lined the walls. Clay pots held milk or ale. Wooden barrels stood in neat rows. Nothing was wasted, for the winter demanded caution. Above, hanging from the smoky rafters, were more stores: ropes of onions, slabs of meat, bunches of herbs. The smoke from the hearth cured them slowly, keeping them from rotting. In this way, the house itself was a giant preservation chamber, every corner serving a purpose. The light of the hearth reached everywhere, but never fully. Shadows clung to the edges of the hall, flickering and shifting with the fire's movement. In these dim corners, children whispered and played games while dogs curled up to sleep. Lanterns filled with fish oil, their flames fed by wicks of twisted fiber, offered small pools of light. But the true brilliance always came from the central fire, glowing red and gold, steady and alive. Life around the hearth was not only practical but sacred. The Vikings believed the hearth had a spirit, a guardian presence. To neglect it was to invite misfortune. Offerings were sometimes placed upon the flames, a piece of bread, a drop of ale, as gifts to the unseen powers that watched over the home. In these rituals we glimpse something deeper, the recognition that fire was not merely fuel but life itself, a divine gift that demanded gratitude. The rhythm of the day was marked by the fire. At dawn, embers were stirred, coaxed back into flame, and breakfast was prepared. At midday, the hearth was busy boiling stews of barley, meat or fish, filling the hall with rich aromas. At night, after labor was done, families gathered around it to eat, to talk, to listen to sagas. In the glow of that fire, voices softened and the long shadows grew, carrying imaginations far into the world of gods, heroes, and forgotten lands. Sleep followed naturally, with the fire's glow fading into embers, casting a final warmth upon the benches where the family lay. To walk through such a hall, you would feel its textures: the turf walls, rough and earthy, their smell grounding; the wooden beams above blackened with soot, centuries of smoke etched into their surface; the benches lined with furs soft to the touch, carrying the musk of animals that gave their hides; the air warm, heavy, with the mingled scents of wood smoke, wool, sweat, and food. It was not clean by modern standards, nor bright, yet it was alive, intensely alive, and for those who lived here it was comfort beyond measure. Even the animals became part of this shared warmth. In the bitterest nights, sheep, goats or calves might be brought into the hall, kept close for protection. Their presence added heat, their breathing mingling with that of humans, their quiet sounds filling the darkness. The longhouse was not merely a dwelling for people, but for the entire rhythm of survival. Humans, animals, food, tools, all united under one roof, all bound to the fire at its core. In this way the Viking home was both practical and symbolic. Its very design expressed the priorities of life: the central hearth for warmth and sustenance, the benches for rest, the storage for survival, the shared closeness for protection. It was a place where every detail echoed necessity, yet also where culture, story and belief found space to flourish. The flickering fire was a storyteller, as much as the skalds who spoke beside it. Its light carved shapes into the darkness, shaping memory and myth. So when we think of Viking daily life, let us not imagine only the battles or the voyages across stormy seas. Let us picture instead this quieter world inside the longhouse, the fire glowing, children playing, elders speaking, women weaving, men mending tools, animals breathing softly in the shadows. The air is smoky, the light dim, yet the warmth is real, and the sense of togetherness is profound. This was the rhythm of survival, day by day, flame by flame, story by story, in homes where the hearth never truly died. In the frozen north, survival depended not only on fire and shelter, but also on the careful art of food preservation. The Viking world was not one of constant feasting, as sagas sometimes suggest, but one of balance between scarcity and abundance, between hunger and careful preparation. To endure the long winters, the people had to plan months in advance, storing, drying, salting and smoking their provisions. A Viking home was not only a dwelling, it was also a vault of nourishment, a carefully guarded treasury of life. Picture late autumn in a Viking settlement. The harvest has been brought in, fields stripped bare of barley, oats and rye. The air carries the scent of drying grain, stored in wooden bins or woven sacks, kept high and dry above the ground. Grain was the backbone of the Viking diet, for from it came bread, porridge and ale. To lose the harvest was to lose security, so storage was treated with utmost care. Granaries were lined with stone or raised on stilts, protecting against dampness and the gnawing teeth of rodents. Families knew that each kernel counted, each sack of grain a small shield against the emptiness of winter. Alongside grain came preserved fish, for the sea was as generous as it was dangerous. In coastal villages, men hauled in herring, cod and salmon by the hundreds, especially in the late summer months. These catches could not be eaten all at once, so preservation began immediately. Fish were gutted, split, and laid upon racks to dry in the sharp northern wind. Others were smoked over slow fires, their flesh absorbing the aroma of smouldering wood. The process transformed fresh fish into stockfish, hard, dry, almost unyielding, yet capable of lasting for months. When boiled, it softened, filling the belly with vital nourishment. This was food not for luxury, but for endurance, for keeping a family alive when snow buried the land. Meat, too, demanded careful preservation. Autumn was the time of slaughter, when herds were reduced to manageable numbers before winter's bite. Sheep, goats and cattle were butchered, their hides cured for clothing, their bones saved for tools, and their flesh preserved for the cold season. Some cuts were salted, packed tightly into barrels where brine kept decay at bay. Others were smoked, hanging from rafters where the hearth smoke curled endlessly upward. Thick slabs of pork, strips of venison, or joints of mutton might hang above the family as they worked and slept, the fire slowly sealing them against the passage of time. Every flicker of the hearth carried not just warmth but preservation, ensuring that food would last until spring. Dairy was another cornerstone, though it too required ingenuity to last. Fresh milk spoiled quickly, especially without the chill of modern storage, so Vikings turned milk into butter, cheese and curds. These could be kept longer, carried on voyages, or buried in cool earth pits for storage. Archaeological finds reveal butter sealed in wooden tubs, sometimes even buried in bogs where the cool, oxygen-poor environment preserved them for astonishing lengths of time. Cheese hardened into sturdy wheels, ready to be sliced and shared when fresh food ran low. Vegetables, though less abundant, also played their role. Onions, leeks and cabbages were staples, hardy enough to last deep into the cold months. Turnips, parsnips and carrots were stored in pits covered in straw, protected from frost. Dried peas and beans were kept in sacks, providing essential protein when meat supplies thinned. Herbs were gathered in summer, tied in bundles, and hung to dry from rafters, their sharp scents mingling with the smoky air. These herbs not only flavored food but offered medicinal qualities, reminders of the deep link between diet and health in a world without doctors as we know them. Drinks too required preparation. Ale was brewed from barley, sweetened with honey or flavored with herbs. Meads made from honey were stored in clay jars, precious and celebratory. Even water, drawn from wells or rivers, was often unsafe, so fermentation became both a cultural and practical necessity. The Vikings drank what they brewed, and in so doing kept themselves alive. The rhythm of storage was not merely practical, but deeply social. Food preservation was a communal act. Families worked together to dry fish, to smoke meat, to brew ale. Children helped gather herbs and peel vegetables. Women churned butter and shaped loaves of bread. Men salted hides and hauled carcasses into storage. The longhouse became a hive of activity, every task connected to survival. In these shared labors, bonds deepened, trust grew, and the community itself was preserved alongside the food. And yet, even with preparation, winters were perilous. Stores could run low, barrels empty sooner than expected, sacks of grain shrink too quickly. Hunger lingered at the edges of every household, a shadow that could not be ignored. When supplies dwindled, families turned to ingenuity, boiling bones to release their last marrow, baking thin bread stretched with husks or bark flour, eating dried berries and nuts gathered in the summer. Hunger taught thrift, taught caution, taught respect for every crumb. We must not imagine this world as bleak only, for the sharing of food also brought joy. Winter feasts, carefully planned, broke the monotony of hardship. A slaughtered animal might provide a night of plenty, with meat roasted over flames, ale poured freely, songs rising into smoky rafters. These feasts were not reckless but calculated, moments of celebration amid survival. They reminded families that life was not merely endured but also enjoyed, even in the harshest of lands. Thus the Viking approach to food was both pragmatic and profound. Every meal represented foresight, every preserved slab of fish or wheel of cheese, a victory over the cold. Storage was more than a matter of diet. It was the difference between life and death, between enduring and perishing. And so within the turf-walled homes, alongside the fire, the presence of food was constant. Its smell, its preparation, its storage, all became part of the daily rhythm. Each bite carried the weight of survival, each shared meal a reaffirmation of community. When you picture a Viking winter, imagine not only the fire glowing, but also the stores lined neatly in shadowed corners, barrels of salted meat, sacks of grain, bundles of dried fish, wheels of cheese, herbs dangling from rafters, root vegetables buried in straw. Imagine the careful rationing, the shared meals, the quiet gratitude that accompanied every plate. For in the frozen north, food was never taken for granted. It was life preserved, hope preserved, the quiet triumph of human endurance against the endless snow. When winter swept across the northern lands, clothing became the first and most constant defense. The Vikings were not strangers to cold. They lived with it, worked in it, sailed through it, and endured it daily. To survive in such an unforgiving climate, they developed garments both practical and symbolic. Clothing was warmth, but it was also identity. Every thread told a story of the sheep in the pastures, of the women at the looms, of the hunters in the forests, and of the travelers who returned with furs from distant lands. Begin with the simplest material, wool. Sheep grazed across the Viking world, hardy animals with thick fleeces that thrived in the harsh landscape. From their wool came the foundation of Viking clothing. Wool had the rare ability to keep its wearer warm even when damp, an essential quality in a land of snow, sea spray, and sudden storms. The wool was shorn in spring, washed, combed, and spun into thread. Women sat by the hearth, distaff and spindle in hand, twisting fibers into long, strong strands. These threads would later be woven into cloth on upright looms that stood tall inside the longhouses. The rhythmic sound of weaving was as common as the crackle of the fire, a background pulse to daily life. The resulting fabric was versatile. It could be thick and coarse, ideal for outer garments that braved wind and snow, or it could be finer, softer, suited for tunics and underclothes worn close to the skin. Viking men often dressed in long woolen tunics belted at the waist, with trousers beneath. Women wore woolen dresses, often with an apron-like overdress fastened at the shoulders with brooches. These layers created not only warmth but elegance, for decoration mattered even in survival. Cloth might be dyed in colors drawn from nature, yellows from birch leaves, reds from madder root, blues from woad, though muted compared to modern dyes. These shades gave life to the dark winter world. Yet wool alone was not enough. Linen, woven from flax, was another staple. It was lighter and cooler, used for undergarments and summer wear. Linen softened with washing, becoming comfortable against the skin. A Viking might wear a linen shirt beneath a woolen tunic, adding both comfort and insulation. Though linen was more labor-intensive, requiring fields of flax, retting in water, and long preparation, its presence in Viking clothing speaks to the patience and skill of their communities. Then came fur, the luxury and necessity of the North. Fur was not just decoration, it was survival, especially in the coldest months. Fox, hare, marten, and squirrel provided small pelts for lining and trim. Larger animals like bears, wolves, or reindeer offered hides that became cloaks and blankets. Fur-lined boots kept feet warm against snow and ice. Fur-lined hoods shielded ears and cheeks from biting winds. A cloak edged with fur was not only practical but also a sign of status. Wealthier Vikings might wear cloaks of rare furs, silver fox or sable, sometimes traded from distant lands, while farmers relied on what their local forests provided. Either way, fur was warmth made visible, warmth worn proudly upon the shoulders. Leather and hide also held importance. Tanned skins became boots, belts, and gloves. Shoes were stitched from multiple pieces of leather, sometimes stuffed with straw for added insulation. Gloves, often woolen but sometimes of leather, kept hands functional in freezing air. Without them, tools could not be held, ropes could not be tied, weapons could not be gripped. A Viking's leatherwork was as vital as his sword or axe, for it protected not in battle but in daily endurance. Layering was the secret to warmth: a linen underlayer, a woolen tunic, woolen trousers or a long dress, a cloak fastened at the shoulder, and perhaps a hood pulled over the head. In deep cold, cloaks could be doubled, or blankets wrapped around the body. Every gap was sealed, every seam mattered. Vikings understood that survival lay not in a single garment, but in the combination, the harmony of cloth and fur, of fiber and skin. This knowledge, passed down through generations, was as crucial as knowledge of farming or fishing. And yet, clothing was never merely functional. It expressed identity, rank, and culture. A chieftain's cloak, dyed deep red and trimmed with rare fur, spoke of wealth and power. A warrior's garments might be decorated with tablet-woven bands, intricate, colorful borders woven separately and stitched onto tunics and cloaks. These patterns, geometric and mesmerizing, were works of art, proof of the weaver's skill and the wearer's pride. Jewelry often accompanied clothing: brooches to fasten dresses, pins to secure cloaks, arm rings gleaming on wrists. Even in the frozen lands, beauty was not abandoned. To dress well was to honor oneself, one's family, and the gods. Women held central roles in this world of textiles. They spun, wove, dyed, and sewed. A well-stocked chest of cloth was a family's security, as valuable as food or weapons. Cloth could be traded, gifted, or used as dowry. When sagas speak of women as keepers of the home, it includes this profound responsibility. clothing the family against death by cold. Each tunic, each cloak, each pair of mittens was an act of care, an act of preservation. The loom was as powerful a tool as the axe. The Vikings also drew from trade to expand their wardrobe. From the east came silk rare and costly, sometimes stitched into garments of the wealthy or used as trim. From the far north came reindeer hides, soft and warm. From the British Isles came fine wools already processed into cloth. Every fur, every bolt of fabric carried with it a story of exchange and connection. To wear foreign silk was to wear a piece of distant lands, proof that the world stretched far beyond the snowy village. As for children, they too were wrapped in wool and fur, though their garments were simpler, cut down from the clothes of their parents. Little cloaks, tiny mittens, woolen caps pulled over small ears. Survival began from the first breath, and so the youngest were guarded carefully against the chill. In sagas one sometimes reads of infants left to die in exposure, yet for those who were cherished, the effort to keep them warm was immense. Blankets layered thick, cradles lined with skins, small bodies swaddled in wool. Clothing rituals also carried symbolic weight. To don a cloak before leaving the home was to step into the world armored against nature's hostility. To remove it at night, folding it carefully, was to acknowledge safety within the longhouse. Garments were mended endlessly, patched with new cloth, stitched again and again, for every thread held value. Nothing was wasted. A worn tunic might become a child's shirt, then a rag, then stuffing for boots. In the Viking world, fabric lived many lives before it was discarded. Imagine a winter night, a family gathers in the glow of the hearth. The father loosens his woolen cloak, shaking off snow. The mother folds her fur-lined shawl around her shoulders. The children sit in layered tunics, feet wrapped in woolen socks tucked inside leather boots. Outside, the wind howls, snow drifts against the turf walls. Inside, clothing and fire together create a cocoon, a fragile but enduring barrier against the frozen dark. Each thread, each stitch is part of that barrier. Each garment is a promise that warmth can be held, that survival is possible. Thus Viking clothing was not simply apparel. It was a technology of endurance, an art of weaving survival into daily life. Wool, linen, leather and fur combined to make not only outfits but lifelines. They carried the people through storms at sea, through nights of snow, through winters that seemed endless. In every cloak fastened with a bronze pin, in every mitten stitched by firelight, lay the quiet triumph of human hands over the power of nature. Fire alone could not do everything. While the central hearth was the heart of a Viking home, glowing constantly, it was not always enough to heat the entire longhouse evenly. The Vikings, though living in what many might think of as a primitive age, were far from primitive in their understanding of warmth. They knew how heat behaved, how air moved, how stone absorbed and released energy. Through centuries of trial, error, and inherited wisdom, they developed innovations that extended the power of fire, guiding it, preserving it, and spreading it through their homes with remarkable ingenuity. Begin with the structure itself. The longhouse was built with heat in mind. Turf walls were not merely for strength. They acted as insulation. Thick earthen layers trapped warmth inside, buffering against the wind and snow. The roof, often steeply pitched, was thatched with straw or reed, creating a natural barrier against the cold. Beneath the thatch lay a layer of smoke. Yes, smoke, for Viking homes were often filled with it, lingering beneath the roof beams. This might seem uncomfortable to us, but the Vikings understood that smoke, though irritating, also carried heat upward, creating a buffer layer beneath the roof that helped keep the interior warmer. The smoke itself slowed heat loss, a strange but effective form of insulation. To control this smoke, they devised vents, not chimneys as we know them, but small openings near the roof ridge. These vents could be adjusted, blocked partially with stones or wooden covers to let smoke escape slowly. Too much smoke was dangerous. Too little meant suffocation. So the household carefully managed the venting, striking a balance between warmth and breathability. The smoke vent was an early form of climate control, a way to fine-tune the environment within the longhouse. Stone also played a role. Many hearths were lined or bordered with large stones chosen for their ability to absorb heat and then radiate it slowly over time. After hours of burning, the stones retained warmth, continuing to heat the room even after the fire died down. Some homes included heated stone benches or platforms, places where people could sit or lie down, drawing warmth from the rock. In the far north, where cold was unrelenting, these stones became silent companions through the night, still warm long after the fire had dimmed. In some advanced cases, especially in wealthier homes or communal halls, archaeologists have found evidence of what may have been early underfloor heating systems. These were not like the Roman hyporchs, but simpler adaptations suited to the materials and needs of the Viking world. Channels were dug beneath the floor, filled with heated stones or covered with planks that allowed warm air from the hearth to circulate. This radiant heat warmed the feet and kept the floor from freezing. While rare, such innovations show that Viking builders were constantly seeking ways to improve comfort, even in the most basic of conditions. Airflow was another subtle art. In a longhouse, drafts could be deadly if uncontrolled. The placement of doors, the alignment of interior walls, even the height of the roof, all affected how air moved. Builders learned to position entrances away from the prevailing wind, sometimes using small porches or entry chambers to block sudden gusts. Inside, partitions helped channel warm air to where it was needed most, around sleeping areas, workspaces and storage. The warmest parts of the house were usually in the center near the hearth, while the outer edges remained cooler. Families learned to sleep closer to the center in winter, sometimes even arranging their bedding around the fire itself, like spokes around a wheel. Furs and textiles added another layer of insulation. Not just worn on the body, they were hung on walls, draped over doorways, or spread across sleeping platforms. Thick woolen hangings could block drafts, creating pockets of warmth. A fur hung behind a bed might keep the cold from seeping through the wall. Even the ceiling beams might be draped with cloth, lowering the effective height of the room and trapping heat closer to the ground. In this way, the interior could be reshaped for winter, adapted to the season like a living organism responding to cold. Ash played a curious role as well. When the fire was banked at night, that is, covered to preserve embers until morning, ash was often used. A layer of ash over glowing coals slowed their burn, allowing them to smolder gently through the night. In the morning, the ash could be brushed aside and the coals stirred back to life with new wood. This method saved precious fuel, prevented the need to relight the fire from scratch, and ensured that some warmth lingered through the coldest hours. It was a simple yet brilliant technique, one passed down through generations. Light and heat were intertwined. The hearth provided both, but in winter light faded early. So Vikings made use of oil lamps, often carved from stone or made of clay, filled with animal fat or fish oil. A small wick, usually made from plant fiber or twisted cloth, would draw the oil and burn with a steady flame. Though not hot like a fire, these lamps added a little warmth, enough to raise the temperature in a small enclosed space. More importantly, they extended the day, allowing work and conversation to continue after sunset, which in the far north might come as early as mid-afternoon. In larger structures, especially communal halls or the homes of chieftains, heating was even more carefully considered. Multiple hearths might be used, spaced along the length of the building. Each had to be managed, fed and vented. In such halls, where many people gathered, the combined body heat of dozens of individuals also contributed to warmth. The architecture worked with this reality, using low ceilings and enclosed walls to trap that collective heat. In winter feasts, the hall might grow almost too warm, a rare and welcome problem in a frozen world. Even animal shelters reflected this heating knowledge. In some longhouses, livestock were kept in attached sections, separated from the human quarters by low walls or partitions. The body heat of cows, sheep and goats contributed subtly to the warmth of the home. Though not always pleasant, this arrangement was efficient. In the coldest months, every source of heat mattered, even the breath and warmth of animals. All of these innovations were rooted in observation. The Vikings were not scientists in the modern sense, but they were close observers of their world. They felt how air moved through a room, how stone held heat, how smoke lingered under the roof. They passed on this knowledge in stories, in the apprenticeship of building, in the rhythm of daily life. To heat a home was to know the land, to understand its cold and its silence, and to respond with creativity. Imagine a winter night in such a home. The fire burns low, stones glowing faintly, ash banked over coals, a fir hanging stirs gently in a draught. Above, smoke lingers beneath the thatch, slowly drifting toward a vent. The air is warm near the hearth, cooler at the edges, but the difference is known and managed. Children sleep close to the center, wrapped in wool. An oil lamp flickers, its flame steady, casting shadows on the walls. The longhouse breathes like a living thing, heat moving through it like blood through veins. Every beam, every stone, every vent is part of that system, a quiet technology born of necessity, refined by centuries of winter. In this way, the Vikings transformed their homes into engines of survival. They did not conquer the cold by brute force, but worked with it, shaping their architecture to hold warmth as carefully as they held grain or water. The hearth may have been the center, but the entire structure participated in the preservation of life. Heating was not a single act, it was a whole philosophy, a way of thinking about shelter, air and fire. Through smoke vents, heated stones, ash banking, airflow design, textile insulation, and even the placement of animals, the Vikings created homes that were more than shelters. They were warm machines, tuned to the rhythm of winter. They remind us that even without modern technology, humans have always been ingenious, adapting with care and patience to the world around them.
If the fire was the heart of the Viking home, then the family was its lifeblood. Heat did not come only from flames or stones. It came from people gathered close, breathing the same air, sharing the same space. In the Viking world, warmth was as much a social act as a physical one. Survival in the north was not only about firewood and walls, it was about closeness, body to body, soul to soul, generation to generation. Within the longhouse, sleeping was rarely solitary. Privacy as we think of it today did not exist. Instead, the night drew people together. Families slept side by side on raised wooden platforms that ran along the walls, sometimes cushioned with straw, sometimes layered with furs and woolen blankets. Children nestled between parents, siblings curled against each other, elders rested with younger kin nearby. Heat radiated from body to body, forming a shared cocoon of warmth. In winter, this closeness was not just comfort, it was life itself. These sleeping platforms were more than beds, they were gathering places, nests of security. Archaeological traces suggest that some platforms could be long, stretching across much of a wall, wide enough for several people. At night, families arranged themselves almost like puzzle pieces, maximizing the contact that conserved warmth. A child might fall asleep with their head against a mother's arm while their feet pressed against a sibling's side. A father might curl slightly to shield younger ones from the draft that slipped through a gap in the wall. Even the family dog, or perhaps a goat or lamb on the coldest nights, might share the platform, its body heat, adding to the collective store. Wool and fur extended this warmth further. Blankets made from sheepskin, cloaks repurposed as covers, and heavy pelts of deer, bear or reindeer became night shelters. A single heavy pelt could drape over several sleepers at once, forming a communal covering that locked in body heat beneath it. The layering of blankets, people and even woven wall hangings turned the sleeping platform into a pocket of stability amid the freezing air. The act of sleeping together was also an act of reassurance. In the darkness of the long winter night, which could stretch for 16 or more hours in the far north, fear could creep in as easily as cold. Outside, wolves howled across the frozen land, winds roared against the turf walls, and snow pressed heavily on the thatched roof. But inside, the sound of breathing, the rhythm of hearts, and the warmth of bodies created a sense of safety. To drift into sleep surrounded by kin was to know that one was not alone, that warmth and life were shared. Communal warmth extended beyond immediate family. In larger halls, retainers, servants or guests might also find space along the walls. The hierarchy of sleeping reflected social bonds. the highest ranking closest to the central hearth, the lower ranks farther away, where the air was cooler. Yet even these outer places were warmed by proximity, for heat drifted outward, and the collective presence of many bodies raised the temperature of the hall. At feasts when dozens might stay the night in a chieftain's hall, the sheer density of people could keep the space warmer than any hearth alone could manage. Stories and songs also added to this warmth. Before sleep, families often told tales, recited sag, or sang lullabies. These were not merely entertainments, they were rituals of togetherness. The spoken word carried comfort, weaving bonds in the dim glow of firelight. Children fell asleep to the sound of voices which, like warmth, was shared equally among all who gathered. Even in silence, the presence of others was felt, each breath misting faintly in the cold air, blending with the next. The Vikings also practiced rituals of hospitality that reinforced this sense of communal warmth. A guest was never left to sleep alone in the cold. Hospitality demanded inclusion. To share a bed or a fur with a stranger was not unusual, it was an expected part of survival. Warmth was too precious to withhold, and generosity was a mark of honor. By giving warmth, one gave life, a gift remembered and repaid in kind. Children grew up within this world of shared space and shared heat. From their earliest days they learned to nestle into the crook of an arm, to burrow beneath wool, to fall asleep to the warmth of bodies pressed close. The memory of these nights would follow them into adulthood, shaping their sense of family and community. To them, closeness was not discomfort, it was the very definition of safety. Even in death, this connection was remembered. In sagas, we sometimes read of companions lying beside each other, keeping vigil through the cold, refusing to let even the frozen night separate them. Warmth and loyalty were entwined, and the act of keeping another warm could be seen as the deepest form of care. Imagine such a night within a Viking longhouse. The fire has been banked, its glow dim but steady, the stones of the hearth still radiate, sending faint waves of warmth into the air. Around the fire the family settles into their platform, cloaks pulled over shoulders, furs spread wide, a child curls against a mother's side, an elder leans against the wall wrapped in wool, breathing slows. Somewhere near the door, the dog shifts, sighs and settles again. The hall quiets, yet the presence of bodies fills it with life. Cold presses against the turf walls, but it cannot enter, for warmth is gathered here in this tangle of kinship and closeness. This way of sleeping, so different from the solitary beds of our modern world, carried with it a wisdom. The Vikings knew that survival in the north was not only about fire, but about each other. To lie together was to share warmth, but also to share trust, comfort, and the reassurance that no one faced the winter night alone. It was a physical fact, but also an emotional truth. Warmth is stronger when it is shared. And so through countless winters, Viking families endured, not because their fires never failed, not because their walls were perfect shields against cold, but because they had one another. Communal warmth was their greatest technology, older and deeper than hearthstones or vents. It was the warmth of family, of community, of breath and skin, and spirit. In this they remind us that survival has always been a collective act, that warmth in its truest form is not only heat but togetherness.
For the Vikings, animals were not merely possessions or sources of food. They were essential companions in the long struggle against the cold. In the deep winters of Scandinavia, animals provided warmth in more ways than one, through their bodies, their furs, their milk, and their very presence inside the home. To live in the north was to weave human life together with animal life, creating bonds that were as practical as they were emotional. The longhouse itself was built with this partnership in mind. In many designs, a section of the building was set aside as a byre, a space where cattle, goats, or sheep could be sheltered during the harshest months. The separation between human and animal was partial at best. A low wall or wooden partition might divide the living quarters from the animal stalls, but the creature's heat was still felt. The warmth of a few cows, exhaled into the air and radiating from their massive bodies, could raise the temperature of the hall by several degrees. In a land where every degree mattered, this was not a small gift. At night, the sounds of animals blended with the rhythm of human life. the steady breathing of a cow, the occasional shuffle of hooves, the soft bleating of sheep. These became part of the longhouse's lullaby. Children fell asleep to these sounds, comforted by their familiarity. For the Vikings, animals were never distant. They were inside the home, sharing the same air, contributing not only food but life-sustaining warmth. Goats and sheep provided an especially intimate warmth. Their wool was the raw material for the blankets and cloaks that wrapped sleepers through the night. Every sheared fleece was transformed into yarn, spun and woven into garments that became second skins against the cold. A cloak woven from thick wool could keep out wind, shed moisture, and trap body heat so effectively that it became a treasure as valuable as weapons or jewelry. And yet, even before being shorn, the animals themselves offered heat simply by being near. In the coldest winters, small livestock might be allowed to sleep close to human platforms, their warmth joining the family's collective cocoon. Dogs too played a crucial role. The Viking dog was not only a working animal, guarding, herding, and hunting, but also a companion of the hearth. Archaeological evidence suggests that dogs often lived inside longhouses alongside their owners. In sagas and poems, dogs are described with affection, their loyalty celebrated. At night, a dog curling at the feet of its master offered more than warmth. It offered trust, protection, and companionship. The heat of a dog's body, steady and comforting, was a bond of friendship as old as humanity itself. In Norse mythology, animals were bound to human survival in symbolic ways as well. Cows appear in creation stories. The primeval cow Audhumla nourished the first being with her milk, while she herself licked the salty ice blocks of the frozen world. This myth reflects the deep connection between cows and survival in the north, where their milk, warmth, and presence were essential. The sagas are filled with references to animals not as distant resources but as partners in life. To share warmth with an animal was to affirm this ancient partnership. Horses, though often kept in stables separate from the living quarters, contributed in their own way. Their thick hides and powerful bodies made them symbols of strength, endurance, and fertility. While they may not have shared the sleeping platforms of the family, their hides, once processed, provided some of the warmest and most durable leather for winter wear. Horsehair was used in ropes and bedding. Even indirectly, horses gave warmth, their presence woven into the household economy of survival. On the coldest nights, when the wind howled and frost crept across the inside walls, the presence of animals inside the hall was not always romantic. It was messy, smelly, and noisy, but it was necessary. Survival outweighed discomfort, and families accepted the mingling of lives. Children grew up accustomed to the earthy smell of straw and manure, the heat rising from cow stalls, the sounds of shifting bodies in the dark. To them this was simply life, a life sustained by the closeness of beasts as well as kin. The furs of animals extended their warmth beyond life. Bears, reindeer, wolves, and foxes, hunted with risk and skill, provided pelts that became prized possessions. A bearskin laid across a sleeping platform turned the bed into a fortress of heat. A reindeer hide, with its hollow hairs, insulated better than nearly anything else in the north. These furs were not just practical, they carried symbolic weight. To sleep beneath the pelt of a bear was to take into oneself the bear's strength, its endurance through winter, its deep reserves of power. In Viking culture, warmth was physical, but it was also spiritual, a gift passed from animal to human, a merging of lives. Even birds contributed. Down plucked from ducks and geese was used to fill bedding and cloaks. The softness of feathers trapped warmth and created comfort in the long nights. A down-stuffed pillow or blanket was a luxury, but one that carried immense value. In households that could afford them, feathers added yet another layer to the human-animal alliance of survival. The relationship with animals was practical, but it was also emotional. Archaeological burials show that Vikings sometimes laid their dogs beside them in death, or included horse bones in graves, honoring the animals that had shared their lives. To bring warmth in life was to be remembered in death. Such gestures reveal how deeply the Vikings valued their animal companions, not only for their utility, but for their bond. Picture a winter night in a Viking hall. The fire burns low, stones glowing faintly. Along one wall, a family curls together beneath woolen blankets, the dog at their feet, its warmth seeping into the straw bedding. Across a low partition, cows shift in their stalls, their breath rising in clouds that mingle with the smoke. A sheep bleats softly before settling down again. The hall is alive with many kinds of life, all sharing warmth, all contributing to the survival of those within. It is not silence, but it is safety. It is not solitude, but community. In this way, the Vikings lived in partnership with their animals. The warmth they shared was not an accident, but a carefully maintained system, where human and beast together endured what neither could face alone. Warmth was a network, a web of interdependence: fire, stone, body, fur, wool, hide, breath, and trust. Through countless winters this bond endured. It was practical, yes, cows gave milk, sheep gave wool, dogs gave protection, but it was also more profound. Animals were life-bringers, companions in hardship, silent partners against the cold. Their warmth was not only felt in degrees of heat, but in the reassurance of their presence. In the darkest season, when the cold threatened to isolate and divide, animals were bridges linking the human world to the greater web of life. And so, within the Viking home, warmth was never human alone. It was shared across species, across breath and body, woven into the very structure of survival. The longhouse was a world where humans and animals lived as one, where every life gave warmth to another, where survival was collective, never solitary. In that closeness, the Vikings found not only endurance but meaning, for to share warmth is to share life, and in the frozen north there was no greater truth. The warmth that sustained the Vikings was never only physical. It existed in the stories told by the fire, in the rituals of daily life, in the songs that accompanied spinning and weaving. Every hearth in every longhouse was a classroom, every winter night an education in survival. Knowledge of how to stay warm, how to arrange sleeping platforms, how to layer furs and fabrics, how to build hearths and vent smoke. All of this was taught patiently, repeated endlessly, and absorbed unconsciously by those who lived within the longhouse walls. To pass on warmth was to pass on life itself, and the Vikings did so with devotion and care. Children learned firsthand, observing their parents. They watched how a mother adjusted a cloak over a child's shoulders, how a father banked a fire with care, how the placement of stones around the hearth could create pockets of heat. These were lessons without formal instruction, absorbed through imitation and daily experience. The longhouse was a living textbook, and the lessons of warmth were as crucial as learning to hunt, to sail, or to cultivate the land. Survival was taught not in words alone, but in actions repeated countless times, until instinct and muscle memory ensured that the next generation could endure the same winters with confidence. Oral traditions reinforced this knowledge. Sagas and folk tales often included details about life in extreme conditions, describing how ancestors coped with the cold. Stories of legendary heroes surviving harsh winters were not merely entertainment, they were repositories of practical wisdom. A tale of a chieftain who endured a blizzard with clever placement of stones and furs carried with it lessons that were remembered and replicated. Even in moments of myth and exaggeration, the underlying truths about warmth, endurance, and preparation were preserved. The saga itself became a medium for survival, connecting narrative to practical reality. Rituals and customs also played a role. The preparation for winter was a communal event, full of symbolism and practicality. Families and villages gathered to shear sheep, tan hides, spin wool, and stockpile firewood. Each act carried meaning. Shearing in spring ensured fibers for the cold months. Tanning hides transformed raw material into essential clothing. Stacking firewood guaranteed that hearths would not fail. These communal tasks were taught to young people not only for their practical necessity, but as a rite of passage. Participation ensured that knowledge of warmth and survival was embedded in the next generation, preserved through hands-on experience and shared responsibility. Even mythology reinforced these lessons. The Norse pantheon contains stories that underscore the importance of warmth and survival. Fire was sacred, associated with the gods' protection, and hearths were often dedicated to household deities. The goddess Frigg, for example, was linked with domestic life, and her care encompassed not only childbirth and marriage, but also the safety and comfort of the home. Such associations connected daily acts of warmth with moral and spiritual meaning. Lighting the fire, layering furs and tending the hearth were not only survival tactics but expressions of piety and respect. In this way, practical knowledge was intertwined with culture, forming a system that ensured it would endure. Tools and architecture were also passed down with stories. Longhouses were often rebuilt or expanded using knowledge from previous generations. The placement of smoke vents, the layering of turf walls, and the height of the roof were informed by experience, observation, and inherited wisdom. Younger builders apprenticed with elders, learning subtle techniques that would escape written record. How much of the wall to insulate, how wide to make a sleeping platform, how to arrange stones to maximize radiant heat. These were precise calculations passed through practice and memory. The physical structures themselves became repositories of accumulated knowledge, enduring far longer than any individual. The art of textile and fur work was likewise preserved. Spinning, weaving, dyeing and sewing were skills taught over years. A cloak was more than clothing, it was a lesson in layering, in combining materials for warmth, and in understanding the properties of wool, linen and fur. These crafts were slow, meditative and careful, reflecting a culture that understood patience as essential to survival. A single mistake could mean a draft, a loss of warmth, or discomfort through the long winter. In this way, craft and survival were inseparable, and the skills themselves carried the wisdom of generations. Vikings also passed down social knowledge of warmth. Hospitality, for example, was not simply kindness, it was survival strategy. Guests could not be left to freeze outside. Offering warmth through shared space, shared furs and shared food ensured both life and community cohesion. These social practices reinforced the practical techniques of warmth, ensuring that knowledge extended beyond one household to the larger village. Cooperation in cold weather was not only moral but essential. The transmission of these values through stories, ritual and example ensured that the cultural lessons were inseparable from practical survival. Evidence of this legacy endures. Archaeological finds reveal longhouses designed for efficient heating, stone hearths strategically placed, platforms arranged for maximum warmth, furs and textiles preserved in peat bogs or through careful storage tell us how the Vikings layered materials and combined human and animal resources for survival. The structures, tools and garments that remain are not mere artifacts, they are testimonies to knowledge accumulated, refined and transmitted over centuries. They reveal a civilization intimately attuned to its environment, adapting to extremes with ingenuity, care and cultural memory. The lessons of Viking warmth are still relevant today. Modern builders and historians study longhouses to understand natural insulation, airflow management, and radiant heat. Anthropologists examine sleeping arrangements and communal practices to appreciate how social bonds contribute to survival. Even in our world of central heating and climate control, the Viking approach reminds us of the value of observation, adaptation and resourcefulness. Warmth was not only a matter of technology, it was a philosophy of living in harmony with the environment, a balance between human ingenuity, community, and nature. Imagine once again a Viking winter night. Outside, snow presses against the turf walls, winds howl and darkness envelops the land. Inside, generations huddle together, layered in wool, furs and love. The fire burns steadily, stones radiate warmth, and animals breathe gently nearby. Children drift into sleep, absorbing lessons without words, feeling the patterns of survival embedded in every texture, every heat source, every human and animal presence. The longhouse is alive with knowledge, a living, breathing classroom of warmth, safety and endurance. Through this intimate connection of body, mind and community, Vikings ensured that warmth was more than a fleeting sensation. It was an inheritance, a legacy that passed from one generation to the next, encoded in architecture, craft, social bonds and mythology. To know warmth was to know life itself, and in preserving this knowledge, the Vikings left a lesson for all time that survival in the cold is achieved not merely through fire, stone and fur, but through careful observation, patient teaching, and the unbroken chain of human experience. Even today, when scholars study longhouses or sift through peat-preserved textiles, they are tracing the fingerprints of this wisdom. They see the patterns of survival, the logic of airflow, the layering of warmth, and the intricate bonds between humans and animals. They understand that warmth was never an individual pursuit, but a collective achievement, a synthesis of skill, observation, culture, and care. The lessons of the Vikings endure not only in ruins and artifacts but in the very idea that life in extreme conditions requires both ingenuity and intimacy, that physical warmth and emotional warmth are inseparable. The enduring lesson of Viking warmth is a quiet one, yet powerful. It reminds us that knowledge is cumulative, passed from one life to another, enriched with each experience, and preserved in both material culture and social memory. Fire and furs are vital, but so are stories, rituals, and relationships. To survive the cold is to embrace the lessons of those who came before, to honor their ingenuity, and to apply it thoughtfully in one's own life. In this, the Vikings remain teachers, guiding us through the centuries with the simple, profound truth that warmth, physical, emotional, and cultural, is life's most essential companion. In the far north, seasons were not subtle. They were absolute. Summer brought light that stretched late into the evening, but winter arrived with stark severity, shrouding the land in darkness and cold. The Vikings learned that survival was not merely about responding to cold when it came, but anticipating it, respecting its rhythm, and adapting their homes, routines, and rituals to its dominance. Seasonal adaptation became a cornerstone of Viking life, and warmth was central to this practice. To live well was to plan for winter. Long before the first snow fell, preparation began with the harvest. Fields, orchards, and pastures had to be worked efficiently to gather food and store it for months when crops lay buried beneath frost. Grains were dried and stored in bins, salted or smoked fish were packed tightly, and root vegetables were preserved in cellars beneath turf walls. But alongside sustenance, Vikings prepared materials for warmth. Wool was spun and woven, furs were sewn into blankets and cloaks, and firewood was cut, stacked, and seasoned. This preparation was both practical and ritualized, a rhythm of life tied to the cycles of the sun and the moon. When winter finally came, daily routines shifted. The longhouse operated on winter time, not according to daylight, but according to warmth and fire. Early mornings were brief, spent tending hearths before heading to essential work. Tasks were arranged to minimize exposure to the cold. The most physically demanding or outdoor labor often performed during the warmer hours of midday. Even meals were structured to provide energy and warmth, with broths, stews, and porridge designed to sustain heat within the body. The Vikings' understanding of seasonal adaptation was practical and instinctive, a knowledge born of repeated experience. Rituals for enduring the dark months were embedded in social and spiritual life. The winter solstice, known as Yule, marked a turning point. The longest night was observed with fire ceremonies, feasting, and storytelling, all designed to strengthen community bonds and provide psychological warmth against the oppressive darkness. The central hearth became the focal point for these gatherings, symbolizing life, protection, and continuity. Stories of gods and heroes of survival and triumph were told with the intention of instilling courage and hope. Warmth in this context was both literal and metaphorical. It connected people to one another, to their ancestors, and to the natural cycles that govern their existence. Lighting and heat during the winter months were carefully managed. Multiple hearths in larger longhouses were tended with precision, fires banked to last through the night, and embers carefully stoked to provide steady warmth. Stone and turf were used to retain heat longer, and animal furs layered on beds and platforms added insulation. The air within the longhouse was dense with warmth, breath, and smoke, a controlled environment in which life could continue despite the freezing darkness outside. Even the placement of objects mattered. Doors, screens, and textiles were arranged to prevent drafts and maximize retained heat. Sleep during these months was adapted to the extreme. Families clustered closer together on platforms, layering blankets and furs to conserve body heat. Children were placed near parents or siblings, elders positioned centrally to benefit from combined warmth. Animals too were brought closer, their heat contributing to the collective survival strategy. Every aspect of sleeping arrangements reflected careful observation of how warmth moved through space and how humans and animals could create microclimates within the longhouse. The night became a carefully orchestrated balance of heat, comfort, and security. Work and leisure were both shaped by seasonal constraints. Outdoor activities were minimized, and indoor tasks took on heightened importance. Crafting, weaving, and maintenance of tools and weapons became essential for survival, providing both practical benefits and occupation to combat the psychological effects of darkness. Even games and music were infused with the purpose of communal warmth, keeping spirits high and minds engaged. The Vikings understood that warmth was not only a physical need but an emotional one, and social interaction played a crucial role in sustaining it. Animal husbandry adapted to these extremes as well. Livestock were sheltered in attached stalls, body heat shared with humans, and fodder stockpiled to last the winter. The knowledge of how to care for animals during months of deep cold was passed down carefully, ensuring that heat, food, and life could be maintained simultaneously. Even minor miscalculations could result in loss, so careful observation and adaptation were essential. In this sense, warmth was not simply the absence of cold but a continuous management of life, human, animal, and material. Fire rituals were intertwined with these adaptations, lighting the hearth at dusk, maintaining a steady burn, and placing embers strategically were daily ceremonies of survival. Smoke management, ash banking, and stone positioning were not only technical tasks but symbolic acts, reinforcing human mastery over the harsh environment. Each flame was a testament to knowledge, diligence, and respect for nature's power. In the darkest months, the hearth became a sacred space where practical survival and cultural meaning intertwined seamlessly. Food and drink complemented warmth in subtle ways. Broths, stews, and fermented beverages provided internal heat, fortifying bodies against frostbite and exhaustion. Hot liquids were sipped slowly, adding both comfort and nutrition, and meals were often communal, enhancing the social transmission of warmth. Sharing food became a ritualized part of enduring the winter, a practical demonstration that warmth, like survival, was best preserved collectively. Even clothing reflected seasonal adaptation. Layers of wool, linen, and fur were combined with skillful attention to insulation and mobility. Cloaks, hats, mittens, and boots were designed to trap air, resist moisture, and preserve heat. The layering of garments was intuitive yet precise, demonstrating centuries of observation and refinement. Clothing became part of a comprehensive system of winter survival, integrating human physiology with environmental knowledge. Stories told during these months reinforced the lessons of warmth and endurance. Myths of frost giants, gods who battled winter, and heroes who overcame frozen landscapes were not mere entertainment. They were teaching tools embedding practical and philosophical knowledge into memory. Lessons of preparation, resourcefulness, and cooperation were woven into narratives, ensuring that the young absorbed strategies for survival alongside cultural identity. Knowledge of warmth was transmitted as much through story as through hands-on experience. By the end of winter, these adaptations had become internalized. Children who had survived long nights learned instinctively how to layer clothing, arrange furs, manage a hearth, and position themselves near others for optimal warmth. Skills were not abstract, they were embodied, stored in muscle memory and intuition. The Viking approach to seasonal extremes was holistic, combining architecture, social structure, craft, food, ritual, and animal management into a unified system that ensured survival, comfort, and cultural continuity. Even in hindsight, the ingenuity of these adaptations is remarkable. Modern scholars studying longhouses, textiles, and archaeological remains are struck by the precision and effectiveness of Viking strategies. From the careful design of smoke vents to the placement of sleeping platforms, every detail reflects an understanding of thermal dynamics, human behavior, and environmental adaptation that is both practical and elegant. The integration of materials, social and cultural practices created a resilient system that functioned reliably under extreme conditions, a testament to observation, experimentation, and collective memory. The seasonal rituals, adaptations, and architectural innovations were not isolated practices but part of a continuous dialogue with nature. Vikings learned from the land, from the behavior of animals, and from centuries of observation, crafting a lifestyle that allowed them to thrive in some of the harshest climates in Europe. Winter, with its long nights and biting cold, became a teacher, shaping architecture, customs, and community. Through careful attention to warmth in fire, structure, clothing, social bonds, and animals, the Vikings created a comprehensive survival strategy that balanced practicality, culture, and psychology. Imagine again a winter evening. The longhouses bathed in firelight, hearths glowing steadily. Families sit close, layered in furs and wool, sharing warmth with children, elders, and animals alike. Stories are told, meals are shared, and rituals are quietly observed. The air is heavy with heat, smoke, and the subtle scents of animals and cooking. Outside, snow presses against the walls, darkness stretches across the land, and wind rattles the thatch. Yet inside, the longhouse is alive, a microcosm of human ingenuity, cultural memory, and communal resilience. Each adaptation, each ritual, each small gesture of care contributes to a network of warmth that sustains life through the harshest season. Through centuries, these seasonal adaptations and winter rituals were refined and transmitted, becoming central to Viking identity. Warmth was never merely comfort, it was survival, community, and culture intertwined. The lessons of preparation, observation, and collaboration endured, shaping the way generations approached the most extreme months of the year. In this, the Vikings left a legacy not only of architecture and craft but of human resilience, demonstrating that life, even in darkness and cold, can be sustained through knowledge, care, and cooperation. As winter tightened its grip on the northern lands, the Vikings learned that warmth was more than a necessity. It was a philosophy of survival, a practice of community, and a testament to human ingenuity. The fires they lit, the furs they layered, the sleeping arrangements they crafted, the animals they nurtured, and the stories they told all contributed to a complex, interwoven system of endurance. Warmth was not merely physical, it was social, emotional, and cultural. Every element of Viking life was shaped by the need to thrive in a harsh environment, and every act of warmth carried layers of meaning, practical and symbolic alike. Architecture was the foundation of this philosophy. The longhouse, sturdy and insulated with layers of turf, wood, and stone, was designed not only to withstand the wind and snow, but to conserve and distribute heat efficiently. Central hearths provided radiant warmth that extended outward, while smoke vents, raised platforms, and careful spatial arrangements ensured that the living quarters remained as comfortable as possible. Each design decision reflected centuries of observation and refinement, a cumulative knowledge passed from generation to generation. The structure itself became a teacher, silently instructing those who lived within it on how to use space, fire, and materials to endure the cold. Within these walls, human ingenuity took shape in the arrangement of bodies, furs, and blankets. Sleeping together in clusters, layering blankets, and positioning animals nearby created a collective cocoon of warmth. This practice was not merely a response to temperature, it was a form of social engineering, an understanding that humans generate heat together and that survival is strengthened by intimacy and cooperation. Every night, each family reinforced these lessons, turning instinct into wisdom and comfort into an inherited skill. Warmth became a shared responsibility, woven into the very fabric of life. Animals were central to this ecosystem. Cows, sheep, goats, and even dogs contributed not only to food and protection, but to thermal stability. Livestock were sheltered within the longhouse or in attached stalls, their heat raising the ambient temperature and providing essential comfort. Dogs curled at the feet of family members, while small animals added their presence to the collective warmth. Beyond practicality, these creatures carried symbolic weight. Myths and sagas recognized their importance, portraying animals as companions, protectors, and teachers. Humans and animals coexisted in a delicate balance, each contributing to the survival of the other. The warmth of life was never isolated, it was interconnected, extending across species. Rituals and cultural practices reinforced these strategies. Yule celebrations, fire ceremonies, communal feasts, and storytelling were more than entertainment or superstition. They were mechanisms for enduring darkness and cold. Rituals created structure and rhythm, alleviating the psychological strain of long winter nights. They also reinforced knowledge. Stories taught preparation. Feasts reflected the importance of nutrition for warmth, and rituals preserved methods for tending hearths, layering furs, and arranging living spaces. Warmth was encoded in culture, embedded in narratives, and transmitted through shared experience, ensuring that each generation carried forward the wisdom of those who came before. Textile and craft practices exemplified Viking attention to detail. Wool, linen, and fur were processed with care, spun, woven, and sewn into garments and bedding, designed to conserve heat. Each stitch and layer reflected accumulated understanding of materials and insulation. Children learned these skills alongside survival lessons, internalizing both technical knowledge and cultural identity. The act of creating and maintaining clothing was simultaneously practical and symbolic, a daily affirmation of human ingenuity, patience, and attentiveness. Warmth in this sense was both a product of skill and an expression of culture. Food was another instrument of warmth. Stews, broths, and fermented beverages provided internal heat, while communal meals strengthened social bonds and reinforced the shared nature of survival. The Vikings understood that warmth was holistic, physical, emotional, and nutritional. Eating together reinforced the interconnectedness of life, reminding all present that enduring the cold required cooperation, vigilance, and generosity. Sharing sustenance was as essential to survival as fire, furs, and architectural design. Seasonal adaptation was a masterstroke of Viking wisdom. The cycles of summer and winter dictated every aspect of life, from planting and harvesting to social organization, animal husbandry, and fire management. Anticipation of winter was ingrained in daily practice, with preparation for cold becoming a rhythm of life itself. Families learned to read the land, observe animal behavior, and adjust their routines according to temperature, daylight, and weather patterns. Warmth was maintained not only through immediate measures, but through foresight, planning, and disciplined attention to cycles. Each year, the repetition of these patterns strengthened collective knowledge and resilience. Education was integral to this system. Children absorbed lessons through observation, imitation, and participation. They watched elders tend fires, arrange sleeping platforms, care for animals, and perform rituals. They listened to stories that combined myth and practical instruction, learning strategies for warmth alongside cultural values. Knowledge was cumulative, passed seamlessly through experience rather than written manuals. This approach created intuitive understanding, a bodily and cognitive memory of warmth that enabled young Vikings to survive harsh winters and later teach their own children. Learning warmth was a process of immersion, not abstraction, and its lessons were both practical and philosophical. Even in death, the importance of warmth was recognized. Burial practices sometimes included animals, furs, and tools, reflecting a continuity of care and protection that extended beyond life. These gestures acknowledged the centrality of warmth in human experience and the enduring bonds between humans and the living world. Warmth was not transient, it was a value, a cultural principle, a testament to the interdependence of life. The care taken in burial practices underscores the reverence Vikings held for survival, comfort, and preparation, even in their final moments. The enduring legacy of Viking warmth is evident in archaeology, architecture, and cultural memory. Longhouses, preserved textiles, tools, and artifacts reveal intricate knowledge of heat management, communal living, and survival strategies. Modern scholars study these remains to understand not only historical technology but also social organization, human ingenuity, and resilience in extreme climates. The lessons of the Vikings extend beyond history. They teach us about adaptation, cooperation, and the integration of physical, social, and cultural strategies for enduring hardship. Perhaps most profoundly, Viking warmth teaches that survival is inherently communal. Fire, furs, food, animals, and knowledge were shared. No single individual could endure the full harshness of the North alone. The strategies they developed illustrate the power of cooperation, observation, and interdependence. Life in the longhouse was a constant negotiation between human ingenuity, social bonds, and environmental challenge. Each element of warmth, from architecture to textiles, from hearths to animals, functioned within a network of care and skill, reminding us that resilience is a collective achievement as much as an individual one. Finally, the Vikings leave a timeless lesson for our modern world. Though we live in houses insulated by technology and warmed by electricity or central heating, the principles they developed remain relevant. Observation of nature, preparation for extremes, layering of resources, and attention to social bonds are strategies that transcend time and climate. The human-animal cooperation, the rituals, the anticipation of seasonal change, and the careful management of energy are lessons in sustainability, foresight, and empathy. Warmth, they remind us, is not merely physical, it is relational, cultural, and intentional. Imagine a longhouse one final time. Snowdrifts press against turf walls, the wind howls across frozen fields, and night stretches endlessly. Inside, generations huddle together, animals nearby, fires glowing, blankets layered with care. Stories are told, meals are shared, and rituals quietly observed. Heat circulates through the room, carried by hearth, body, fur, and shared presence. Darkness is kept at bay not only by fire but by knowledge, tradition, and the enduring power of human connection. This microcosm of warmth, life, and culture illustrates the Viking mastery of survival, a lesson that resonates even now. In the end, the story of Viking warmth is not only about enduring cold, but about thriving in harmony with environment, community, and culture. Every element, architecture, clothing, hearth, food, animals, rituals, and storytelling, contributed to a holistic system of survival. Knowledge was carefully preserved and transmitted, ensuring continuity through generations. The Vikings remind us that warmth is more than heat, it is care, foresight, ingenuity, and cooperation. It is a principle of life itself, a foundation for community, and a timeless lesson in resilience.